All right, what's up, Dragon Brood? I actually finally got a chance to look at the ban, and we have some big stuff, particularly for standard. There's a couple other things, but we also want to take a second to talk about what this Leaf standard looking like. So, hopping into the announcements right quick, this was pretty good stuff. We ended up with Badger Mole Cub, Storm Chasers Talent, and Grand all banned in standard. I think this is going to make some people very happy. I think there's a lot of people who were frustrated at seeing enough Badger Mole in different decks. And even myself, there were decks I put it in just because it was the best card to put in, but you kind of didn't want to sometimes, but it just made sense to do. So, I mean, you're not going to not play the best cards. So that much I totally understand. And honestly, there's enough decks that I think will still survive without the Badger Mole Cub, so that's good. When we're talking about Storm Chasers talent, there were already a lot of decks that were able to play without it. However, this does really affect the Is It Prowess decks, right? Because it gave you a card that was both a non-creature spell, but also created a creature. So you didn't lose any tempo or anything, kind of keep your plan going. And obviously, when you can bounce it and replay it and draw a card and whatever, right? That whole cycle of stuff is now gone. So it'd be interesting to see where those decks go. I think they will still exist. I think they're just going to look a little bit different. We have enough things with prowess and enough, cantrips for 1 mana to draw a card or whatever. We've even seen some of them moving away from playing blue at all and just playing mono red. So that's a thing. But we'll talk about that in depth a little bit more here. And Grand also banned. And this was an interesting one because I feel like Standard has mostly evolved past the Grand stage. Not to say the Grand wasn't still played, but not to the extent it was a couple months ago. But I don't think people are going to be upset seeing it gone, right? It at least reduces the amount of lessons you will run into. Again, we'll talk about it. I don't think that deck's necessarily gone, but Grand's on the chopping block. Actually, not on the chopping block, just gone, right? Another couple of interesting bans they put on here was Legacy. Fantastic Car is banned. There was a lot of talk about that before the set even released. And now that they've played with it, they went, yeah, we don't want this in the format. And it's restricted in Vintage, but that's a little less of a problem, only having one copy, because there's a bunch of crazy stuff you can do in Vintage anyway. Yeah, I think an easy place to start is looking at the Is It Prowess decks. I think there's a bunch of versions, or actually, this isn't even Prowess, like Is It Spells, I should say. I think there's a lot of different versions of this deck running around, and this one played Storm Chaser's talent, but otherwise you still have, Boomerang Basics, which now will likely become some other bounce spell, because I don't think this deck has anything of its own it wants to bounce really other than Storm Chaser's talent, though it does still play Slick Shot Show Off for some bonuses from Prowess. It's still in here, but you have Burst Lightning, Flow State, Opt, Shore Up, Sleight of Hand, Spell Pierce, Vibrant Outburst. This selection of spells will likely still be in a lot of these decks. I don't think that's going to change. You'll just see some combination of obviously Storm Chaser's talent being replaced and maybe Boomerang Basics also being replaced. But there's so many things they can interchange in these decks and a bunch of different ways they can go, whether they want to keep trying to do prowess things or whether they want to try to do the spell elementals thing where just playing all the different elemental creatures, or if they even just shift to playing mono blue versus red. So I think it's a good banning in the sense that you can get rid of a card and a deck type still exists, right? We didn't boot it out of the format. I think another notable entry that was playing Badger Mole Cub was the mono green landfall decks being very big, even bigger in best of 3 than they were in best of 1, I would argue. But Badger Mole Cub was a little extra value for those decks, right? Being able to make an extra body, targeting a land that could die and then come back and trigger your landfall. They're not going to have that option anymore, and it does slow the decks down a little bit because you are still, in some of these versions, trying to play things like Ice Still Explorer and, Might Form Harmonizer. Not having access to those cards as quickly, or even having the mana to, say, warp in a Harmonizer and still do the other things, will slow these decks down at least a full turn, if not 2 turns. So that's something else to think about. If you are playing this deck already, that is going to change things quite a bit. So I don't think this deck goes away. Again, I think there's other mana ramp creatures and things you could add into it that they're not playing right now necessarily, but it does definitely change how these decks play. I also wanted to bring up the control decks, because while some of them were playing Grand just for the spell discount, Grand wasn't necessarily pivotal to their functioning, right? Especially if you played in best of 1, it seemed like you weren't seeing Grand in those decks as much as you were seeing them in best of 3 decks, which I found to be a very interesting development. That said, I think these decks are going to be able to cut Grand and still be able to function fine. Does it make them a touch slower with this particular build? Yes, I think so, but they can still swap maybe 2 lands, they can hit lands more consistently, and the 2 Grands become 2 of some other spell, probably something that draws cards or whatever. But overall, they still have the tablet, which we know is very good. We're not gonna be surprised by seeing that still. Otherwise, it's kind of the usual lessons, improvisation capstone, some number of Thor, usually 1 or 2. I don't expect these decks to change drastically, and I think they're still gonna be pretty prevalent in the format. And I think that's, again, a reasonable banning where it slows decks down, it takes some cards out of the format, but it doesn't particularly remove any decks outright. Matter of fact, if people invested in any of these decks, fortunately, you'll still be able to play most of them. Yeah, this version of Is It Prowess is going a little bit harder on the prowess stuff here, where you have Color Storm Stallion, Slick Shot Show Off, and the Storm Chaser's Talent all kind of working off each other in here. And I think these are the versions that will be forced to make some tough decisions a little bit, right? Because playing your Storm Chaser's Talent or being able to bounce it with the Boomerang basics, getting those extra triggers off the Stallion, getting the extra +2 each time from the Slick Shot, it does slow those decks down a little bit. Granted, they could swap up to playing some other small prowess creatures, maybe playing the mouse with prowess that has the trigger, or particularly just swapping those out for other card draw cantrip type things, right? So there are ways these decks can still go, and I don't think they will be completely gone from the format. But if anything, again, slowing them down a turn or two, kind of bringing things more into balance, which I think is what ultimately everybody was looking for. Yeah, overall, I would say the biggest takeaway is that we didn't really lose decks in the format with this banning. And that's always one of the concerns, right? When they ban cards, that some of the decks are just going to completely go away, and all this money or time people have invested into these decks is no longer going to be valid. At least now, as far as I can tell, every deck that played these cards should still be mostly playable. If anything, they're just going to be slowed down by 1 turn, maybe 2. Now, that may lead to some people wanting to make some different deck decisions, which is reasonable. I also wonder how this is going to play with the control decks, right? Does this give the 4 and 5 color control decks we've been seeing a bigger advantage? Or are other decks that were being suppressed by the speed of some of these, Is It Prowess, mono green aggro, whatever, kind of being suppressed to where they have a better chance against these control decks, and we weren't seeing those? Because now, if anything, we might have room for a little more mid-rangey stuff to start making an appearance, and the banning's just in time with the Hobbit around the corner. So y'all let me know how you feel about these bannings. Does it change your decks at all? Does it give you a different outlook on the format? I'd be curious how other people feel about it. But that's all I have for you for now. We'll see you next time.